Good evening. My name is Lucy Nalpathanchil, and I host a daily morning talk show on Connecticut Public Radio called Where We Live. But tonight, I'm moderating this first session of the Two Connecticuts, conversations about race and place. So first, thank you for joining us tonight. Another big thank you to our sponsors who made this series possible, the University of Hartford's President's College, its lifelong learning program, and Office of Diversity and Community Engagement, the Third Age Initiative, a program of Leadership Greater Hartford, and the Connecticut Mirror News Organization. Also, a special thanks to our hosts, Michelle Choi, head of the President's College, Chris Grant, Executive Director for Diversity and Community Engagement at the university, and the staff at the university who made this program possible. They went the extra mile to handle all the logistics, and we are really appreciative. Now, if you haven't done so already, you can sign up for sessions 2, 3, and 4 on housing, education, and regionalism. You can go to Leadership Greater Hartford's website and look under the event panel. Now, tonight's program is virtual. Each of our panelists are participating remotely, and a portion of tonight's conversation may air on Connecticut Public Radio in the coming weeks. Now, if you want to ask a question, you can submit it through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You'll see it there. And when you do submit your question, please say if it's for a specific panelist or for any one of them. And we'll make sure to leave time at the end of the evening to ask your questions as well. So let's start. The series is called Two Connecticuts because our state has two distinct sub-societies, predominantly people of color who are poor, living in core cities, and predominantly white people living in the suburbs and exurbs. The Fair Housing Center says more than 2/3 of the state's population of color lives in just 15 of the state's municipalities. Now, Connecticut is also one of the most dramatically unequal states in the country by almost every metric, from employment and housing to healthcare and life expectancy. Predominantly urban, poor people of color are getting the short end of the stick. Nearly 20% of Black residents, 23% of Hispanic residents live in poverty or lived in poverty before the pandemic, compared to 6% of whites. Now, this is according to Data Haven, which is a New Haven-based nonprofit research firm. In Hartford, the poverty rate exceeds 30%. Now, a large part of why we have two Connecticuts is racism. Racism in the past and racism in the present. So the purpose of tonight's panel is to talk about racism, its effects on individuals, and its effects on the overall economy. So I want to welcome our panel tonight. William Tong is Attorney General of the state of Connecticut. Attorney General Tong took office in January of 2019. He's the first Asian American elected at the statewide level in Connecticut. And before that, he was a member of the Connecticut General Assembly representing the 147th House District, which includes North Stamford and Darien. Attorney General Tong, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Lucy. I muted myself.
Jay Williams is also here, president of the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving. Now, prior to coming to the foundation in 2017, he served as U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Economic Development. He also served as Deputy Director of the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs at the White House, and he arrived in Washington, D.C. after serving as mayor of the city of Youngstown, Ohio. Now, after he moved to Connecticut, I learned about his background, especially his Ohio connection. I'm a Western Pennsylvania native, so I know Youngstown pretty well. And I remember inviting Jay onto the show, and he said yes. So thank you for saying yes then and saying yes tonight and joining us.
Lucy, thank you for the invitation then and for hosting us tonight, and pleased to be here with Attorney General Tong and Dana Peterson. Thank you.
And Dana Peterson, Executive Vice President and Chief Economist at the Conference Board. Dana joined the Conference Board from Citibank, where for many years she served as a North America economist and later as a global economist. She's co-author of the 2020 study, Closing the Racial Inequality Gap, the economic cost of Black inequality in the US. Now, Dana has a Connecticut connection. She earned her undergraduate degree in economics at Wesleyan University. Dana, a pleasure to have you here with us tonight.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor to be here.
And again, we'll leave time in about an hour for audience questions. Again, you can submit those in the Q&A button below. Now, Dana, I wanted to start with you. We're going to talk about your landmark 2020 study on racial inequality, but I wanted to ask you, I mentioned that you're a graduate of Wesleyan, and at the time your study was released last year, you also shared publicly how you experienced racism during your time at Wesleyan and also early in your career. And so I'm wondering if you could share some of those stories with us.
Sure. Well, I think certainly I remember sharing that when I was at Citigroup, I didn't put my picture up on my profile for emails because I was concerned about people potentially judging and making, thinking things that weren't necessarily true, just given what I looked like, being a woman, being, African American. And so unfortunately, that led me to believe that, I'd get along better if I didn't put my picture up, so that I would just basically leave people guessing until they met me. That was very early on in my career, but over time I still never put my picture up. But I'm proud to say that where I am now, the Conference Board, yes, I feel comfortable doing that. And I think that's so important for young people to feel comfortable in their own skin and be able to operate in their own cultures and be accepted wherever they are.
You told Bloomberg that when you attended Wesleyan, you encountered some classmates who questioned your admission to this elite school and whether it was a result of affirmative action policies rather than your own merit. And so when I read that, I thought about all the microaggressions that people of color experience every day. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about that. And when you shared that anecdote with us that early on in your career, you were not confident of sharing your picture because you were worried about how people would see you. I mean, I'm wondering, is that the cumulative impact of when we talk about these microaggressions that we all experience on this panel?
I would say yes. Certainly when it comes to higher education and college, the assumption oftentimes of people, some people, is that, if there's a person of color there, that they're there because there's some quota, right? And that, they're on some big scholarship, usually an athletic scholarship, and all sorts of, stereotypes about why people are there, and that they're not necessarily there because of their own merit or their own talent. And I remember my response was, well, how did I get into the school? Well, I applied and they accepted me. And also my parents and I paid a lot of money for me to go there. So, it's really sad that, this was, 25 years ago now. But potentially some students are still facing these kinds of things today on campuses where a lot of assumptions are made about their intelligence, about their abilities, that really should not be made.
So knowing that, a little bit about your background, again, thank you for sharing that with us. I wanted you to talk about what prompted you to do this study, again, looking at the economic impacts of racism on individuals as well as our society as a whole, thinking to you about your experiences as a Black woman and what the numbers can tell people, right? It's not emotional, but the data is there, and how are we going to approach this?
Sure, absolutely. The report was actually in response to the death and murder of Mr. George Floyd last year, and what was going on in terms of people protesting in the streets. And, a lot of folks were kind of surprised, while, many persons of color just weren't surprised. We were saying, well, this is, a continuation of behaviors that, extend back to the days of slavery and Jim Crow, and where it just seemed like it's just okay for violence against, persons of color. And so, being at an investment bank and in the research division, I was also on a diversity committee, and we sat around and we're trying to think about ideas of how do we address this? How do we answer questions that many of our our employees had, and even our customers who were institutional investors for the most part. And so the idea, I said, well, why don't we just write something? I mean, that's what we do all day. We write research. And so because I was an economist, I said, well, let's look at this less from an emotional angle, but from an economic perspective. What are we leaving on the table by allowing there to be gaps between different races along wages and education and access to home ownership and access to financing to start a business? These things have their roots from hundreds of years ago here in the Americas, but there's no reason why we can't address them today. And one thing we found was, well, let's look at the data, right? The hard data, and come up with estimates of how much money is being just kind of tossed away because we as a society are allowing gaps to persist. And we came up with a really wild and incredible number. That was $16 trillion. The US economy in any one year is close to 20 trillion. So that's a lot of money that's being left on the table because people are not aware of or not willing to do anything about these racial economic gaps. And again, this was just looking at gaps for Black persons, but I would imagine the gaps would be even greater if we added on gaps for women and other ethnic groups.
So to put a finer point on this, that your report found that if 4 key racial gaps for Blacks, wages, education, housing, and investment, if they had been closed 20 years ago, $16 trillion could have been added to the US economy. And if the gaps are closed today, $5 trillion can be added to the US GDP over the next few years.
Yes. And if we think about what that means in terms of growth, before the pandemic, the US economy was growing around 2.5%, right? But imagine if you added 2 or 3 tenths to that. That's getting you close to 3%, right? Policies, every administration wants to create policies to generate 3% growth perpetually. And it's like, well, here's something that we can do to generate that amount of growth. And indeed, you mentioned that. Suppose we close all these gaps today. What would growth look like over the next 5 years? Yes, so it's something along the lines of $5 trillion, and that's like adding a 0.5 percentage point to GDP growth, right? So that's really astounding. That's really strong growth that we're just foregoing by allowing these gaps to persist.
We know that the pandemic has hit business owners hard. We look at the greater toll that Black-owned businesses have experienced. What's holding Black entrepreneurs back when you look at the research that you've done?
Well, it's fascinating that 13 trillion of that $16 trillion was due to the fact that you had business revenues that were never created because Black-owned businesses either didn't have access to capital to start the business, or they started the business, and because they didn't have access to financing, they were not able to keep the doors open. And these numbers sound really big, but to bring it home, imagine if 6 million people a year had a job, right? And so that's essentially what we were losing, 6 million jobs a year, because these businesses did not have access to capital.
We're going to be returning to the economic effects of racism throughout this hour, but I wanted to also talk about the effects of racism on individuals. Dana, you were very open in sharing some of your experiences. Jay Williams, I wanted to go to you. In 2017, LeBron James said it's tough being Black in America. Now it's 2021. What's your response to what he shared and what you have lived in the last many?
It's still tough. In 2021, it's still tough being Black in America. I would choose to live in no other country. That being said, it doesn't negate or excuse the challenges that people of color, and particularly Black people, face in this community, in this country. All of us, all of us as people of color can share experiences that I'm sure are both overt and macro aggressions, but also microaggressions, to the point where it almost becomes background music. And that's unfortunate. You just almost subconsciously react to these things. And as Dana was sharing some of her experiences, Even after having arrived here 4 years ago, I remember very clearly that a very prominent business person in this community who I had served on a board with over the past year or so saw me after a couple of months and saw that my hair had changed. I had grown my hair out. And after the meeting, he came up to me and said, "Hey, I haven't seen you in a few months." And he said, "When I first saw you, your hair made me wonder if that would be someone who would be qualified to oversee a $1 billion philanthropic institution." And the fact that he said it so casually and sort of almost jokingly, it was just shocking to me that, having known me, knowing what my position is, that his first impression after having not seen me for a few months was that. So imagine what the impression or the thoughts are for individuals he has no relationship with, that he has no experience with. So things like that to, being pulled out of, stopped by the police and asked to step out of my car and being told that I look like a robbery suspect at about 11:30 p.m. as I was driving on my way home from church. So how I could be identified as looking like a robbery suspect in the middle of the night, in a moving vehicle, driving through a part of town that perhaps it was perceived I shouldn't have been in. So you just add those things up over the course of one's life or career, and it is difficult in this country. And the figures that Dana had in the report were just staggering. In fact, I was reading and citing that report prior to knowing that I was going to have an opportunity to be on a panel with her. So, the economic effects, but as you talked about, Lucy, the personal costs, loss of creativity, the dehumanization of individuals, specifically and intentionally because of their race, has such a deleterious effect on this country and our communities that it is hard to imagine, the losses that we've incurred in terms of productivity and creativity and ingenuity and intellectual contributions because of the structural racism this country still endures.
Attorney General Tong, you've also been on my show and you've been very open about your upbringing. I remember you shared a story with me about something someone said to you when you were campaigning. You were asking for their vote. Can you share that with us?
Sure. Let me just say that we've used the term microaggressions. I think what we've described so far are pretty macro. You know what people are saying to you when they say them. And as you tell these stories, Jay, Dana, and Lucy, I think all of us had hoped that we'd reach some level of professional or social achievement, and maybe it would be different. And it's really not any different than it's always been. And for me, so on the one hand, we all face the really macro overt aggressions. When I was elected, I was called Kim Jong Tong by an activist on the other side. I'm routinely accused of being a sleeper cell or an agent of the Chinese Communist Party on social media. I've been called a Manchurian AG. Those are all obvious, overt things. And I can tell you as your Attorney General, I can take it. What's harder though is, you're right, when it's more pernicious and insidious and people don't really even understand that they're being overtly and macro racist to you. And so the episode Lucy talked about was, I was running for Attorney General. I think it's fair to say that I was a leading candidate, if not leading candidate. And we have an old style convention here in the state where you got to go and ask delegates, about 1,200 delegates, for their vote at a convention, which I won with 65% of the vote. But I went to this delegate, I spoke to her on the phone. She was a white woman attorney, Democrat, right? So should be, and I think by all rights, a progressive, open-minded, liberal person, thoughtful person. And when I was in legislature, served 12 years, but 4 years as chairman of the Judiciary Committee, which is one of the most pivotal roles in the legislature. And so I called her and I said, basically, can I have your support at the convention? And she said, well, William, you've done an incredible job in the legislature. I am so proud of the work that you've done on gun violence, on criminal justice reform, on civil rights. You're wonderful in the legislature. And I said, so I can count on your vote then? And she said, no, I'm sorry. I'm not voting for you. And I said, why? She said, you just don't look like what I think an attorney general should look like. And we all know what she was saying. We all know what she was saying. And that in that moment, people ask me, how did you respond? And I wish I could tell you I had some snappy comeback or grandiloquent response. I just couldn't get off the phone fast enough. It hurt that much and sticks with me to this day. That's how I wake up every morning.
We know that people that are our audience tonight, they want to know more about how we became two Connecticuts, right? And ways that communities work together to confront racism, maybe on an individual basis or collectively. And when we talk about the emotional impact of these comments, right, directed towards people of color every day, no matter what they've achieved or who they are. But we know that studies also show, and I'll go back to you, Jay, that people who experience racism suffer both physical and mental health issues, including post-traumatic stress. So why isn't this discussed more? And what is the impact on the children in our state?
You're right. And when you talked about, all three of the panels talked about how far back this goes, just the title of this session, A House Divided. I mean, that term has its origins in scripture, but it also was used by Abraham Lincoln over 160 years ago when he was giving a speech. And it was when the country was facing the proposition of whether or not, slavery was going to be the norm or whether the abolitionist movement was going to prevail. And clearly, while slavery was abolished, the seeds of racism were planted and they still manifest and germinate and bear fruit today. And to your point, Lucy, the social, emotional, the psychological impacts that are borne by Blacks and people of color have a significant detrimental and adverse effect. And that is a weight that many of our young people carry with us. I'll speak from my own experience of having an 11-year-old son. And there are conversations that I have and have to have with my son as a young Black boy growing up that try to explain to him that, the way that the values that we're instilling in him, the things that he will experience and the mistakes that he will make are natural part of growing up, but that there is also a level of consciousness that he has to have. And try to imagine not overburdening 11-year-old with the fact that, being Black has a different set of circumstances in this, but yet and still wanting him to enjoy the innocence and the adventures of childhood. So, we're fortunate, my wife and I, and my wife is pursuing her master's degree in licensed clinical counseling. So we're fortunate to have a set of tools, hopefully, and supports that will help him navigate that. But I realize that is not the case for so many other young people, young boys and girls who go through this. So, it isn't comfortable to talk about. Sometimes there's an expectation, just, deal with it or press through it. Sometimes there's an expectation, the perceived inferiority is just the norm. That's just the cultural struggle of Black people because somehow, they've gotten themselves into these circumstances and situations with no acknowledgement of the structural and systemic, systems that have really perpetuated this for so many years. So that social, emotional, psychological burden is very real. And we see it manifest itself in a variety of ways, in the educational system, in the contact and interaction that Blacks and people of color have with the legal system, the financial system. It is just, I'm not sure that there is a place in society that it doesn't manifest itself in some adverse way over the course of the lives of people of color.
Attorney General Tong, let's get into the systemic reasons, especially in our state, of why Connecticut has become what it is today, these two Connecticuts. When we think about your upbringing and what you noticed in terms of, are some things historical accident versus intentional discriminatory practices? How do we have this conversation? Because as Jay mentioned, it can be uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think we all know that a lot of the effects are not accidental; they're intentional. And as we talk through this in Dana's story about not wanting her picture associated with her email, why did she do that? Because she didn't want people to know that she's a Black woman, and make judgments about her and assumptions about her without getting a chance to engage with her. And that happens every single day in schools and workplaces, in public spaces across the state. If people don't think I look like what an attorney general should look like, I am sure in classrooms across the state, children are told every single day, because of what they look like, they don't look like what a journalist should look like. And frankly, how many Lucy Nalpathanchils are there, in journalism? Or that they don't look like what an economist looks like, or a nonprofit executive looks like. And so there's that kind of everyday pernicious limitation on people. But of course, we're going to talk about all of these issues, everything from housing, credit, access to capital, redlining, de facto segregation in our schools, the lack of funding for urban school districts, the lack of after-school programming and supports for working parents, two working parents. Jay mentioned how he and his wife, and me and my wife, we're very fortunate, but I think Jay and Dana, you probably would agree with me, we caught a few breaks along the way too, and it could have easily gone the other way. And Lucy, I've talked to you about this. You remember the Huang family of Simsbury? They own a nail salon, and during the Trump presidency, they were nearly deported in early 2018. We were able to help them stay in this country. But the reason why I got engaged in that is people in Simsbury and Farmington rose up, their customers, and they demonstrated and said, we want to save these people and this family, two Chinese immigrants with two American-born sons. But the reason why I got engaged is because my sister is a journalist. She sent me a text and forwarded an article about the Huangs. And she just sent me a simple message: that could easily be us. If life had just taken one turn to the left by 5 degrees, it could easily be us, and we could be in a very different place. And so I think you see that across the state, that people don't have the same opportunities. They suffer from these structural barriers, and it's very hard to break through them.
When we talk about institutional racism, what more can the state of Connecticut do besides having these kinds of conversations that are led by community groups to figure out how we got here and where we need to go? I'll ask you, Jay, and I want to bring Dana back into the conversation as well.
One of the things that the state has done that should be credited and acknowledged, and I'm sure Attorney General Tong may have been in the legislature or has some knowledge of this, is that there was a commission created to evaluate the impact of legislation that's passed in Connecticut on people of color, to ensure that there isn't disparate impact or unintentional consequences. So that, to me, is a very conscious and intentional acknowledgement that there is a problem, that legislation that on its face may look benign and may intend it to be benign, but the fact that the commission now is charged with evaluating and analyzing to ensure that there aren't any malignant effects, I think is something that is very positive and a step in the right direction. In addition to, I think, what is happening with respect to some of the zoning, the challenges to the zoning in some of our communities in this state that have used exclusionary zoning to keep communities of color from living in their community, and the fact that that is making its way through the courts. And I think that there need to be more advocacy groups and the state taking position out. So those are two things I think that I can cite off the top of my head that are steps in the right direction, but are certainly in and of themselves not enough. And I'll end by saying that, you know, part of the other reason that this is so difficult is because people want quick and easy solutions. And when you have a structural problem, whether it's a structural problem at your house or a structural problem anywhere, there is no quick, easy solution. It's messy, it's expensive, it's challenging. But if you're going to make a sound organization, state, or structure, you have to get to the root of the problem, and that is a very, very daunting task, but one that I don't think, and I don't think any of us think, that we have any options or alternatives to accept.
Dana, going back to your report, looking at the economic impact, and when Jay mentions housing in Connecticut, there has been a movement to, you know, change zoning laws that prevent people that aren't as wealthy in certain communities, or definitely people of color, from living in particular neighborhoods. And when you look at housing across our country and the idea of how this is a way to build wealth, and how that has been something, that a barrier for many people of color. Can you talk about what your study has found?
Sure, it's interesting just hearing about actions and activities to restrict zoning to keep communities out. This is not new. I mean, you can go back more than a century, and where you had communities, governments, individuals, and even in the financial sector, all working together, insurers and financiers, all working together to keep neighborhoods looking a certain way, and keeping, you know, communities of color out of neighborhoods. And so while some of those laws may have changed, and, you know, insurance companies try not to redline, you still have these actions, right? And it comes through, you know, changing zoning. It comes through realtors having codes for certain neighborhoods and steering families, you know, to this neighborhood instead of that neighborhood. And these kinds of things are still going on. And even, for example, there was a recent, in the last few years, that, you know, one of the big tech companies had like a real estate finding app, and the app was being discriminatory. And the app is not itself discriminatory; it's just reflecting attitudes that of the people who are building it. And so, I mean, none of this is surprising to me. And I think that you know, what's key is that we have these conversations. For the most part, I haven't really received a ton of pushback about the report, but one key thing that has come up is that people see this as a zero-sum game, right? That if I let so-and-so into my neighborhood, or if, you know, someone else, you know, who looks different from I do gets that job, that it's going to negatively affect me. And we really need to think about growing the pie, right? Especially when you think about the business world. If a company says it's not interested in, you know, making sure that its staffing and its supply chain are more diverse, then they're saying that they're not interested in growing, right? Because if you're not growing, then you do have a zero-sum game. So I think that you know, certainly more conversations and helping people to understand not just the current circumstances, but how we got here, right? And that many of those attitudes may not have changed, and people, you know, their behaviors indicate that they think this is a zero-sum game, and that, you know, if anyone else gains, that it's a loss for them. And really, when it comes to society and companies, a lot of times it's about growth. And the paper itself tells us that, you know, if you get rid of these things, which are difficult, as Jay said, but if you work towards it, then everyone benefits.
Okay.
So see, if I can just add, I completely agree with Dana that it is not a zero-sum game, that we need to grow the pie, grow the economy. But I also like to add a little caveat that we do have to acknowledge if there have been systemic and intentional policies and approaches that have allowed individuals or groups of individuals to benefit at the expense of others. When you level the playing field, it does mean that perhaps there are going to be others who can compete more effectively. There are going to be others who are now given opportunities that if you were being unjustly enriched because others were being held back, and you say, now let's have a level playing field and let everybody compete on their own merits and not have artificial barriers, it might mean that someone who was getting, X may get a little less than X, not because the system should now benefit unfairly others, but because there is a level playing field. So I'm all about growing the pie, but I also think it's important to note that a lot of the wealth that has been obtained isn't because a group of people were more ingenious or more intelligent, but if my ancestors or our ancestors didn't have an opportunity to purchase property or to have access to capital to start their businesses, and now they do, then that means that they have an opportunity to participate in that wealth building too. So growing the pie is absolutely the right way to do it, but we also have to acknowledge that some may have less, not because something's being taken from them, but because others are now able to more fairly and equitably compete.
Attorney General Tong.
Yeah, if I may, I think related to that is the racist and hateful phenomenon of scapegoating. And so I think on the one hand, if you look at it as a zero-sum game, you can sort of rationally say, well, people are being unreasonable, right? They're thinking that there's a zero-sum game, there's a limited pie, and I'm trying to hold other people back because of their race, because they may take from me, and also because I don't like them because of what they look like and who they are. That's one way of looking at it. But there's also another force that's related, which is people may think that their share, their portion of the pie is limited because of somebody else, because of who they are and what they did to them. And there's a lot of blame and scapegoating. And frankly, a lot of that's happening to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders right now. Where people point the finger either economically that people from Asia and particularly China are responsible for taking jobs or economic opportunity or growth away from America and American companies, or just blaming them for the pandemic and calling it the China virus or the Kung flu. So I think related to this zero sum idea is also this scapegoating and how racism is used as a tool and a weapon for people to blame others for their own misfortune or perceived misfortune.
I think when we look at what's happening in current events, the talk about, the fear of what leveling the playing field really means, or frankly, understanding our history, to understand how we got to this place. I can't help but think of what we're seeing in communities, not only in other red states, but here in Connecticut, in particular towns where you have parents and others upset about critical race theory, the scapegoating, the blame game. I'm wondering if our panelists can talk about that. Dana or Jay, would you like to start?
Dana, you want to start?
Sure. I guess the thing is that I'm not an attorney, and so I don't know all the details about, critical race theory, and it was born out of the legal profession. But what I do know is that it's essentially a framework for looking at racism in the United States, and where even, historically, even when there were attempts at redress, it was still from a perspective of, lesser beings. Right. So, for example, I think Brown versus the Board of Education, the thought was, well, we should allow integration because it would be good for the Black students to be around the white students. So, as opposed to, these students are all, equal human beings and capable of the same achievements, and both sets are capable of learning. So I think, there's a lot of misunderstanding about what the principle is. What is it? And then, elements in terms of people thinking, well, it's, the first principle is that, we can blame an entire group of people, even people living now, for the sins of the past. And I don't think that's necessarily what the goal is. It's a framework. And I think that ideally, we should want to learn from our past so that we don't repeat those things. And I mean, there's no arguing from an economic perspective that when the United States was, founded, that the economy was based upon, slavery and indentured servitude. So I mean, that's just in the history books, and we shouldn't ignore that, but we should try to learn from that and how we can make sure that those inequities and those things, those tragedies that happen, aren't repeated today in our modern context.
Dan is actually absolutely right. And I am not an attorney, nor am I an expert on critical race theory, but I did read an article that I would offer to anybody interested in it. And it was an article by Jelani Cobb in the Annals of Equality. And it talked about the origins of critical race theory. And it is tied to a civil rights attorney by the name of Derek Bell. And Dana's right, it is an academic framework through which to view the origins of this country. And part of what Derek Bell was intrigued by was that despite the efforts and some legal successes to repeal the racist laws and policies, that somehow racism was so deeply rooted that it was still able to assert itself in different ways. And we still see that happening today. And the article points out a very successful and intentional movement to mischaracterize what critical race theory is, to turn it into, the boogeyman and the thing that is easily used to divide and rile up. So again, there can be and should be very deep debates and discussions around it. But what it is not is this notion that is a tool to blame an entire race of people for racism in and of itself. But to Dana's point, having a debate about the history of this country is just the facts are the facts. There are no alternative facts. They're the facts of slavery, the economic effects of slavery, the benefits that this country accrued, and the detriments that it left to Blacks and people of color. So, that article was enlightening to me. But I think most of all, it talked about the very specific and intentional and thus so far successful effort to mischaracterize critical race theory and use it again as a tool to undermine discussions around the real issues the real structural racism that this country absolutely has to deal with.
Let's hear from the attorney.
So I am an attorney, and I play one on TV, I guess. And let me just be really clear about this. I feel very strongly about it. This whole issue, this debate is absurd. This controversy was started by Donald Trump in a presidential election to divide people and drive his base out to vote for him, period. It's driven by hate and a message of hate and division. The idea, by the way, that racism and race is present and challenges and infects every public and private institution in this country is not a new idea, nor is it controversial. It happens to be true. And we learned this as kids and in high schools well before anybody put a label on it, right? This is just sort of basic and part of our fullest understanding, right, of how we got here. Your question earlier of how we got here. And anybody who denies that is either wrong, ignorant, or hateful.
When people hear CRT or critical race theory, are they confusing it with DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion? And, a question for you, Attorney General Tong, do teachers have enough job protections to teach anti-racist history in our state?
Do teachers have enough job protections? I think teachers have an obligation to teach the truth to our students. And no, I don't think that there's any confusion. I think most people understand who, had a fairly complete education, that race and racism is a persistent challenge that we have to confront and overcome in this country. Again, it is a difficult and ugly truth, but not a controversial one. Not controversial in that We all know that it's true. We live it every single day. And you don't have to be Asian American, South Asian, African American, Latinx to know that. Everybody knows that. And this sort of willful denial of truth, willful denial of science, right? Willful denial of the fact that masks save lives and you ought to take the vaccine. This willful denial of what we know and see in front of us is really maybe even more corrosive, right, than the racism and hate that we're talking about right now.
Jay Williams, one of our members of the audience, would like you to repeat the info about the Jelani Cobb article you mentioned.
Sure, and I just put it in the question and answer. It was in the Annals of Equality, the Journal of the Annals of Equality. It's the September issue. The article was titled "The Man Behind Critical Race Theory" by Jelani Cobb. Jelani is his first name, Cobb, C-O-B-B. And the article date was September 13th, 2021. So I also, again, put it in the Q&A, the answer part of the Q&A.
Jay, we talked about this whole conversation is about the two Connecticuts and the policies that got us here. And I'm wondering, is this unique to Connecticut? As the former mayor of Youngstown, Ohio, was there two Ohios?
There were two Ohios. This is not, because there are two Americas. This is not unique to Connecticut. It is perhaps more pronounced in Connecticut because of the wealth disparities, the level of inequity, the concentration of poverty in a handful of mid-sized cities, whether it be Hartford or New Haven or Bridgeport or Waterbury, versus the rest of the state. So it is by no means unique to Connecticut, but Connecticut is one of the states with the highest degree of inequity and disparity on virtually every measure that you can think of: economic, health, educational, attainment, and otherwise.
Dana, I wanted to go back to you to get back to the economy and the impact the racism has on it. When we look at states, including Connecticut, having set-asides or grant programs aimed at helping businesses owned by people of color, by women, do they work? Is there any room for reform?
I think there's always room for improvement. I think one great thing out of the tragedies of last year is that many financial firms stepped up and they said, you know what, a lot of the wealth disparity and income disparity lies at our doorstep. I mean, we are the gatekeepers to capital. We in part determine who gets to own a home, to build wealth, that intergenerational wealth that you mentioned. We're the gatekeepers in terms of who has access to capital, traditional forms of capital, banking, and even, thinking about how banks are starting to invest in venture capital firms and partner with them and startups and things like that. They're the gatekeepers. And so something close to $50 billion was committed by financial firms towards DE&I initiatives and equity, and making sure that there's fairness in terms of the issuance of capital. And I think that's just so important. But the first thing many of these financial firms had to do was look inwardly and say to themselves, well, it's one thing to spout a message to the populace, to society, about what we're going to do externally, but what do we look like internally, making sure that we ourselves have the proper initiatives, that we're not doing things to hold people back, from advancing in their careers, from having that mobility, that stretch assignment, getting promoted. Also making sure that our boards are more reflective of our, society and also our customers, right? And that you can't just have one person who's different on the board, because that person's going to be a very lonely person, and that you need many people of different perspectives, including different races and genders. And so I think that, this, again, from the tragedies of last year, you've seen this awakening amongst financial firms in particular, that they play a huge role in helping to eradicate some of these gaps, particularly the gaps that are related to wealth.
Can we talk about the tax system? I'm getting a question from the audience citing Dorothy Brown's book, The Whiteness of Wealth, a focus on how tax systems impoverish Black Americans. So can you connect a few dots pertaining to the systemic or institutional racism we've talked about here in our state?
Sure, I can jump in. One thing that we found in the research is that when you look at the accumulation of home equity over since the great financial crisis, since the housing boom, predominantly white communities saw tremendous gains in the equity of their homes, but predominantly communities that were predominantly of color actually saw a negative. They saw their home values go down, and it's more often than not that these homes are undervalued. And indeed, there was a report by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York that was published this week that indicated that it's oh no, it wasn't the Federal Reserve. I think it was Freddie Mac or one of the GSEs, that it's just routine that these homes for persons of color, families of color, are routinely underassessed. So why is that happening? And so there's no clear answer to that. And one answer is, well, bias, right? And so what should be done about this? Well, there should be an examination of the systems and the underwriting rules and everything involved with home purchases to make sure that you don't have these inherent biases that deny people the right and the ability to accumulate income and to accumulate wealth and be a part of that American dream.
Attorney General Tong, when we talk about the racial wealth gap, we have thought leaders and others talking about reparations, from Senator Elizabeth Warren on down to Ta-Nehisi Coates. And so is there a strong moral argument to this, or how do we get this idea promoted politically, or is it something that's a non-starter?
Sorry, it's only been a year and a half. I should know how to unmute. When you say the word reparations, that sets off a lot of reactions from people. To me, it is a message about repairing the damage that's been done by structural institutional racism, affirmative overt hate and racism, and what are the most effective means of delivering that repair, right? And on the one hand, people talk about compensation. On the other hand, we're talking about investment in schools, institutional investments in infrastructure in urban communities, transportation, right? One of the things that we were just talking about in terms of the tax system and then relatedly the housing system, I live in Stamford, which many people consider to be the economic engine of our state, one of the most economically successful cities in the Northeast. That means there's a lot of gentrification going on. And it's really important that people not get displaced and that we have 10, 20% affordable housing requirements in new developments to keep people not only in the neighborhoods in which they grew up, but make sure that people have access to these new developments and that people don't just get marginalized and pushed into communities that then get systemically undervalued, right, when you buy a house there. So I think all of that is part of the overall question of repair. And I think all of us could come up with a very long list of investments that are underfunded. I'm sure Jay has a list too long to show, in this short hour of all the things that we could invest in that would provide that repair that's so needed in these communities.
I do think repair is needed, and I appreciate and I agree with Attorney General Tong in terms of focusing on the word repair. But let's be clear: this country has paid historically reparations. This country has compensated financially aggrieved parties, and history shows reparations were paid to slave owners that were it's hard to even say that sort of whose property, people, were removed or lost. So financial payment of reparations is not a new concept in this country, but I think a more productive discussion is around how do we repair, whether it's through investments, whether it's through tax policy, whether it's through any number of ways. So I think if we focus on the need to repair in the multiple paths there are to repair, perhaps we can find some actions and paths forward, as opposed to what the, again, critics would want you to think is reparations is simply writing checks to groups of people who in their telling aren't responsible or would not make use or are undeserving. So, if we can get past all the controversy, the repair that Attorney Tong talked about, to me is certainly something meritorious of discussion.
What's your take?
This is a tough topic because, Jay is absolutely right. Historically, there have been instances where parties were repaired and received, land or finances to pay for a loss. The complication is, fast forward to now, where you have people who say, well, those are my ancestors. I wasn't involved in those things. And then, the argument is, well, some of you are benefiting from things that happened, years ago when, your parents and grandparents were, benefited from the GI Bill. They were allowed to move to the suburbs and buy homes and accumulate wealth. And, someone else's grandparents were not allowed to do that. They were forbidden. So they never were able to make those investments and generate their own forms of wealth. So I think that, certainly the prospect is not foreign, and certainly, the U.S. can do whatever it wants to do and has done reparations for different groups. But I agree with Attorney General Tong that, because the issues are structural, that potentially, just writing checks to individuals is not the best thing to do, right? But investing in ways to, again, eliminate the gaps, right? And make sure that there's a benefit to the broader society as you're benefiting, individuals that, do have an adequate, grievance and claim. And, I just think about, the Tulsa riots, and there's a plaque there that has an estimate of how much money was lost. And I'm not sure if that was in, the 1921 dollars, or if that's cumulative, but either way, it's in the billions, right? And yet those people have never been compensated, right? They've never received any recompense. And so, and if you think about all the businesses that, weren't perpetuated and the families that were destroyed from that, and all the generational wealth that was not created, then an entire town and society. And also, there's a study that shows that people who had knowledge of that event were less likely to invest in housing and businesses because of fear that the same thing would happen to them. And so it became the structural, a singular event in one area became a structural issue. So I think that the solutions definitely have to be structural, and that we need to help people understand that, again, this is going to help everybody, right? It's not helpful to have entire cities where people are impoverished, right? And that there's crime and death and those kinds of things. It's beneficial for everyone if we invest to make lives of everyone better.
Well, we reached a point in our program where I'm going to start audience questions that we've been getting. Again, if you have a question for our panelists, be sure to add that to the Q&A button. Attorney General Tong, Barbara makes an interesting point. I wanted you to respond. She writes, the first thing to do to end structural racism is to stop putting people in positions of power who effectively maintain structural racism. And I just wanted to go back to the housing conversation, because when we think about, trying to encourage towns to change their zoning, to have more affordable housing, that doesn't really work. But that's what we hear from our governor, right? Like, let's come up with compromise. But it's 2021. When are people going to actually understand that when you don't have certain types of safe housing, clean housing, affordable housing that impacts children when they can't access schools, and that cycle continues? I mean, we're all familiar with Harvard University's Opportunity Atlas, where you live, your zip code impacts your outcome as an adult. So I'm wondering if you can respond to Barbara's point.
Well, I guess I agree. It's a fair point. It's on all of us to make that happen. You know, I'm a Democrat, and I obviously do not support President Trump, but I'm not somebody who thought in 2016, the first time, that he stole the election. The American people chose Donald Trump, and he was their president for 4 years, and then they chose President Biden. And I think we all have to take some responsibility for that and not otherize the people who elect our elected leaders. The second thing I'll say is, I think all of us contribute to it if we're honest about it. And that's why it's structural. And all of us have to fight, you know, the structural racism that each of us benefit from every single day. And I think if you're honest about that, I live in a wonderful community. Jay, I'm sure you and your wife live in a wonderful, safe community. I'm not sure what town you live in, but I certainly don't live in the community that my parents first lived in when they came here as immigrants 50 years ago. And I benefit from structural racism and systems that tend to benefit people in suburbs and tend to benefit people who have wealth, or at least can make a living wage and provide for their families. And so, yes, Barbara, it's true, but all of us have to contribute to that.
Dana, someone wanted to hear more from you, and sorry, I'm just trying to go through here. When we talk about the trillions lost because of these racial gaps, you know, how is the dollar amount of the gaps measured or calculated? Can you get into that a little bit?
Sure. For the 4 gaps that we looked at, which were wages, education, home ownership, and business access to capital, we had somewhat different calculations for each. So I think, let me just find one that's kind of easy to talk about. So for example, access to higher education. As Lucy stated, that yes, what zip code you live in oftentimes determines your outcome in life. And so we said, well, what if we look at the gap between persons who, white persons who have bachelor degrees versus not, right? And look at that gap. And then look at the same gap for Black Americans. And for Black Americans, the gap is huge. So we said, what if we narrowed the gap to match the same gap of white Americans, right? People who have a degree versus those who don't. And how much that would generate in terms of income, because we know from tons of studies that people who have a college degree or a degree in a trade make thousands of dollars more over the course of a lifetime than a person who doesn't. And we said, well, how much money, if we multiply this, you know, close the gap, right? How many people you would have with a degree and how much more money they would make, and add that up over all the people over 20 years. And we came up with a number, right? And it was a big number, something like $113 billion, right? So that's a lot of money that was never generated because people did not have a college degree or a degree in a trade. So that's one way. I'm sorry that was very complicated, but we actually did think really hard about, you know, what happens if you close the gap, how many dollars are generated. And then we came up with 16 trillion. We checked the number over and over again because it just seems so outrageous.
Indeed. Jay, I wanted to get you back into the conversation. Someone in the audience wants to hear from the panelists. You know, did the Black Lives Matter movement really make a difference?
So yeah, I'll talk. First of all, again, I just want to quickly, Attorney General Tong, I've got all the respect and award for you, but I'm not sure that I've ever benefited from structural racism. So at another time, I'd love to delve into that, and I'm not sure that a choice of where any of us live means that we're benefiting from structural racism. But in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, if the question is, does it make a difference? I do think it has made a difference. So let's point out, Black Lives Matter movement didn't start with George Floyd. I mean, that term was coined a few years ago in the St. Louis around the issues, and I'm sorry I'm forgetting the individual's name, but in that event that resulted in the death of a Black man. So I think more than the Black Lives Matter term, the George Floyd murder, which again was unfortunately one in a long line of murders of Blacks at the hands of law enforcement and others. And I'm not here, saying law enforcement. That notion that it galvanized the globe in a way that hadn't happened in a long time, because we were all ensconced in our homes because of the pandemic. There was worldwide focus on the murder of George Floyd. So I'm not sure if it's Black Lives Matter. The difference was really, I think, made by this being brought to our consciousness in a way that perhaps others hadn't in a while. And this happened to be a murder that was caught on film. And I also want to acknowledge those that weren't caught and did not go viral. So I think that there is value in the declaration. And I'll end by saying Black Lives, like anything, it's been politicized and it's been used as a weapon on both sides. What I see Black Lives Matter is it's a declaration. And it was a declaration that needed to be made because there was a series of homicides and murders that seemed to just be oblivious to the larger society, that just seemed to go, well, there's another Black person being murdered, and next, we'll talk about the weather or your plans for the weekend. So it was born out of this frustration that, wait a minute, there's something wrong with the fact that we see countless numbers of Black people being murdered, and there's no public consciousness or outrage about it. So again, people can argue legitimately about how it's been politicized or where people have used it for purposes that it was not originally intended. But I do think that it has helped to bring to consciousness some of the challenges that have been underway in this country for a very, very long time.
Something we saw here in our state with Black Lives Matter is attention on the relationship between law enforcement and communities of color, and police accountability law that passed and signed in our state. Attorney General Tong, do you think that made a difference?
It absolutely made a difference, as did the excessive use of force law that I wrote and passed in 2015. These are tough, emotional, gut-wrenching debates, but they're important. The Second Chance Society law, the bail reform law, the criminal justice reform work we've done here in the state, all of it has made a difference in disconnecting us from a system of mass incarceration that is not only unjust, but has been a huge drag on our economy. And because of the actions that we've taken, our prison population has been cut by half in this state in the short time that I've been in public service. I think most people in our state see that as real progress and understand that incarcerating young people, particularly young Black men, has only one effect, and it sentences them to a life of dereliction often, and homelessness and joblessness and hopelessness if you go into a correctional facility at a young age. And we often said in the legislature, the only thing prison is good for is teaching you how to be a better criminal. And so these are the things that we're trying to get away from. And all of these changes that we have undertaken in the legislature have made a huge difference. And I think that the efforts of the legislature and the police accountability bill have gone a long way to restoring trust. It's not easy. It's not going to happen overnight, but restoring trust in our criminal justice institutions and between the people of this state and our law enforcement institutions.
We talk about police accountability and laws to limit force that police use. In these discussions, we also heard the phrase defund the police. I'm wondering if we can talk about that and how that particular sentiment, right, that they want to see funding allocated more towards other community efforts and not towards law enforcement, how that has further divisions. Do you agree with that at all?
So that's not productive. And if we want to talk about making investments in housing, in transportation, in schools, you know, in providing the sort of anti-racist system of education and giving all kids in the Hartford area a chance, and really meeting the goals of the Sheff versus O'Neill litigation and settlement, let's talk about that. You know, language like defund the police is just not productive, and it's not right, and it's not realistic. You know, what I hear most from when I walk through a neighborhood in Hartford, and I've done it recently with a group of women who lost their children to gun violence in Hartford, is that we need strong law enforcement in our community to protect us and to help keep us safe. And so the idea that we don't need or honor the role of law enforcement is wrong.
We just have a couple of minutes left, and I definitely want to hear from each of you for some takeaways for our audience. But, you know, something that keeps coming up, of course, in our state, again, is housing. One of the sessions for the two Connecticuts will be focused on housing, the next one, so be sure to sign up for that. But here's a question for our panelists. Some minorities, even in Connecticut's legislature, claim that their success demonstrates that racism does not exist. So how do you counter that argument made by some Connecticut legislators? And they're referencing, if we all remember, some of those very long public hearings when there was talk of zoning reform. And so Attorney General Tong, do you want to address that? And I'll ask Jay as well.
You're pushing all my buttons now, Lucy. And let me just say, Jay, first of all, I appreciate your honesty, and we can talk about. My only observation was that, for example, single acre and 2 acre zoning in Connecticut has been referred to by people as exclusionary and an example of structural racism. And if you live in a town that has single or double acre exclusionary zoning, that's going to accrete to your property value, and you're a beneficiary of that, no matter who you are. And that was my only observation. I certainly didn't mean to suggest that you were personally looking to be a beneficiary, but all I'm saying is that we're all part of this system, right? And we have to recognize that we all have an obligation to dismantle a structurally racist system. The final thing I do want to say, Lucy, and you as a South Asian woman understand, there have been people who have made the argument that people have done well, people of color have done well, and therefore there's no racism. It's obviously very personal for me because it is a mode of attack that's used against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and to divide us from our sisters and brothers in other communities of color. And we all know that myths like the model minority myth are not true. I will take you right now to downtown Hartford and walk through Southeast Asian communities and Chinese American communities that struggle. And people are looking for the same access to educational and economic opportunity as everybody else, and they're disadvantaged by structural racism and bias and barriers. So at the end of the day, what is really hard for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders is that in this conversation about race, we are largely invisible. I mean, look at the comments, right? Over and over again, people, allies, friends, use the terms Black and brown, right? Which seems to omit Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, omits Muslim Americans, right? Omits South Asians, omits our Afghan sisters and brothers who are now coming as a result of the war in their native land. We have to broaden this understanding that there are many communities of color, right? There are many communities of color that are disadvantaged by structural racism, and that we have a lot of work to do to overcome that.
Our time has grown short, but I want to hear from each of the panelists on one thing that you would like the audience to take with them as we consider how to address this issue of two Connecticuts. Jay, go ahead.
Well, conversations like this, and I appreciate all of those who took time out of their evening away from their family, their work, whatever they happen to be doing on a Wednesday evening to engage in this conversation. We've learned. I know I've taken away things, and I've learned so much just from my fellow panelists and from the questions. And I will end by crediting Attorney General Tong, who did a much more masterful job than I could when you think about how to respond to, in my opinion, such an asinine argument of the fact that because there are a few successful or any number of successful people of color, Black people, Asian people, you name it, that racism doesn't exist. I mean, that is just a denial of reality beyond sometimes what I am able to tactfully address, because the data is there. I mean, Dana pointed out the data that demonstrates the disparities, the inequities. We see it. You had I was the first Black mayor of Youngstown, Ohio. That did in no way, shape, or form eliminate racism in Youngstown, Ohio. Barack Obama's election, while a milestone, and I was privileged to serve in that administration, then we saw Donald Trump. So it is something that Attorney Tong talked about. I agree with him, but I say to the audience, thank you for your time. Thank you for your willingness to put yourselves out in front of these conversations, and looking forward to the series, which I think is exceptionally important as we move forward.
Look at that. I did that now. I just year and a half, right? Attorney General Tong. Dana, we used your report as a peg to this really interesting conversation that we've had. And I know there's a link out there for audience members to dig in more. And it's been, about a year since that report came out. And so for the Connecticut audience here, what do you want them to consider when they walk away and think about how they can tackle the two Connecticut's where they live?
I absolutely agree with Jay in terms of it's important for us to continue to have these conversations. And I think the important thing for people to walk away with is not to despair and to say, well, the problem is just so big, I can't do anything about it, so I'm just going to go back to my life, right? But to think about like what element of this you can become passionate about and do something about, right? And, certainly really easy things that we can do, for example, just like voting, right? Voting in every election, not just the federal presidential election, but your state and local elections, making sure that you're showing up for, town halls in your town to express your opinions and also to hear other people's opinions. And I think, just having a civil discourse is so important because it's so easy for the discourse to devolve into shouting and anger and people, throwing up their hands and nothing getting done. So I want to encourage people to continue to listen, even when you don't necessarily agree with the opinion, and try to empathize and think about where the other party is coming from, and then try to figure out ways to find some commonality so that you can move forward.
Attorney General Tong, you get the last word.
Thank you. Let me just say that I see some comments in the chat that now we need action, and that's absolutely right. We've learned a lot from each other. We've talked about housing. We've talked about access to credit. We've talked about our education system. I've got to figure out how to move forward, under the principles of the settlement in Sheff versus O'Neill, to make sure that everybody, all students in the Hartford area have access to a quality education without regard to their race and background. And so we have work to do, right? We have a lot of work to do. And I encourage everybody to be a part of it.
Well, Attorney General William Tong, Hartford Foundation for Public Giving President Jay Williams, and Dana Peterson, Chief Economist at the Conference Board, it was a pleasure to hear from you. And on behalf of University of Hartford and the other community partners tonight, thank you for joining us. And to the audience, thank you as well.
Thank you for being such a great host, Lucy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Attorney General.
Thank you.